The sterile glow of hospital lights flickered softly down a bustling hallway. Doctors, nurses, and patients moved with purpose, their steps echoing off the tiled floors. In the midst of the controlled chaos, Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the hospital's lead surgeon, strode through the corridor with an air of self-assured authority. Known for his sharp surgical skills and an equally sharp tongue, he had a reputation that preceded him. To some, he was a genius who saved lives daily. To others, he was a storm waiting to explode, especially when things didn't go his way. On this particular morning, Dr. Hayes was running late for his pre-surgical rounds. A mix-up in the OR schedule had already frayed his nerves, and the coffee he'd spilled on his pristine white coat earlier only added to his irritation. He turned a corner sharply, muttering under his breath about incompetence and the endless parade of problems he seemed to deal with daily. Just as he reached the nurse's station, his gaze landed on a figure he didn't recognize. She was new, that much was clear. Standing tall with an undeniable poise, the woman was dressed immaculately in a nurse's uniform, her natural hair framing her face like a crown. There was something about her presence that immediately commanded attention, though she wasn't making any effort to do so. She was simply reviewing a patient's chart, her expression calm and focused. "Excuse me," Dr. Hayes barked, his voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. The woman looked up, her steady gaze meeting his. She didn't flinch or appear fazed by his abrupt tone, which only seemed to irritate him further. "Who are you, and why are you standing around instead of doing your job?" The hallway seemed to grow quieter as nearby staff subtly glanced at the scene unfolding. The woman didn't rush to answer. Instead, she took a deliberate moment to close the patient's chart and turn fully toward him. "My name is Dr. Maya Bennett," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm reviewing critical information for a patient." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Doctor," he repeated mockingly. "Right. Look, whatever your title is, you're standing in the way of actual work getting done here. This is a busy hospital, in case you hadn't noticed." There it was, the condescension he often wielded like a weapon, the kind of tone that made junior staff shrink back and question their worth. But Dr. Bennett didn't budge. Her gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. "I'm well aware of how busy this hospital is," she said evenly. "Perhaps if you're feeling overwhelmed, you should take a moment to collect yourself before addressing colleagues." The remark hit like a thunderclap. A low murmur spread through the hallway as a few nurses exchanged glances, their eyes wide with surprise. Dr. Hayes' face darkened, his smirk vanishing. "Overwhelmed?" he repeated, his voice low and tight. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to. And I don't think you understand the importance of mutual respect in a workplace," Dr. Bennett countered, her tone unwavering. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients to attend to." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Dr. Hayes standing there, stunned into silence. For a moment, he was too taken aback to respond. His usual quick retorts and cutting remarks seemed to fail him, replaced by a simmering anger. Who did she think she was? A nurse, no, a new nurse. Lecturing him, the lead surgeon. The audacity was beyond anything he'd experienced in years. But what Dr. Hayes didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Dr. Maya Bennett wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't even a subordinate in the traditional sense. And as the events of the day unfolded, the truth of her position and her authority would change everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and leadership. For now, though, he remained in the dark, his frustration mounting as he stormed off toward the OR. Little did he realize that the very person he had tried to belittle was about to become someone he would answer to, and someone who would challenge his entire approach to medicine and teamwork. The stage was set for a collision of egos, but also for a lesson in humility that Dr. Hayes desperately needed. And somewhere down the hallway, Dr. Bennett smiled to herself, fully aware of the storm she'd just walked into. But she wasn't worried. She'd have faced challenges far greater than a hot-headed surgeon with an inflated sense of self. What lay ahead wasn't just a professional test for Dr. Hayes. It was a reckoning he never saw coming. Dr. Hayes stormed down the hallway, his steps quick and deliberate, each one a testament to the simmering frustration bubbling beneath the surface. His mind was racing, replaying the brief exchange with Dr. Bennett. Her calm demeanor, her measured words, none of it made sense to him. Nurses didn't talk to him like that. Heck, no one talked to him like that. He prided himself on his dominance in the hospital, a dominance earned through years of long shifts, sleepless nights, and high-pressure surgeries where lives hung by a thread. Yet, here she was, the new nurse, or so he assumed, speaking to him as though they were equals. The idea made him scoff aloud as he reached the locker room. He yanked open his locker, grabbed his fresh coat, and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the otherwise empty space. The hospital was no place for ego trips, he told himself, conveniently ignoring his own growing ego in the moment. He brushed off the encounter, deciding it wasn't worth his time to dwell on. He had a surgery to perform, and that was what mattered. Saving lives, proving himself, staying on top. That's what defined him. At least, that's what he thought. Meanwhile, Dr. Bennett was making her rounds, her calm exterior hiding a mind equally as sharp and focused as Dr. Hayes, though her methods couldn't have been more different. Her journey to this moment had been anything but easy, and the battles she had fought to get to where she was today had shaped her into someone who knew how to stand firm, even in the face of arrogance or ignorance. She wasn't just a new face at the hospital, she was the new chief of medicine, hand-picked to bring order and fresh perspective to a system that desperately needed it. And she wasn't here to make friends, nor was she here to seek validation from people like Dr. Hayes. Her focus was on improving patient care and creating an environment where teamwork and respect weren't just buzzwords but lived values. As she walked the halls, she could feel the curious eyes of staff following her. News of the earlier exchange with Dr. Hayes had already started to spread. Whispers trailed behind her, but she didn't acknowledge them. She was used to this. A black woman in a position of power, she had seen it all: underestimation, passive-aggressive remarks, blatant challenges to her authority. It came with the territory, but it never defined her. She had a bigger purpose, and she wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, distract her. But as much as she tried to maintain her composure, there was something about Dr. Hayes that intrigued her. She had read his file before starting at the hospital. His surgical success rate was among the highest in the region. Patients often praised him for his skill, but staff turnover in his department was unusually high, and there had been complaints, unofficial, of course, about his temper. A man like him thrived on control, and she knew her presence was already disrupting the balance he had carefully constructed for himself. Later that afternoon, Dr. Hayes was scrubbing in for surgery. The operating room, his sanctuary, was the one place where he felt invincible. The hum of machines, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the intense focus on the task at hand. It was where he was at his best. As he donned his gloves and adjusted his mask, he pushed all thoughts of Dr. Bennett out of his mind. The patient's life depended on his precision and expertise, and he wouldn't let anything distract him. The procedure went smoothly, as it always did under his capable hands. But as he exited the OR and began debriefing his team, he noticed something unusual. The staff seemed tense, their responses clipped and their body language guarded. He brushed it off at first, assuming they were simply tired. But as the day went on, the unease began to gnaw at him. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet tension that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until he overheard a conversation in the break room that the pieces began to fall into place. Two nurses were talking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the hum of the vending machine. "Did you see her earlier? She didn't even flinch when Dr. Hayes went off on her," one nurse said, her voice a mix of awe and amusement. "I know," the other replied, "and the way she just walked away like that. Honestly, I think she's exactly what this place needs." Dr. Hayes felt his stomach tighten. They were talking about Dr. Bennett. The realization hit him like a cold splash of water. People were already taking sides, and from the sound of it, they weren't on his. His mind raced with questions. Who was she really? Why did she have such a strong presence? And why was everyone talking about her as if she was someone important? The revelation left him reeling. Memories of their earlier encounter flooded back, but now they carried a weight he hadn't understood at the time. Her confidence, her calm demeanor, the way she had stood her ground. It all made sense now. She wasn't challenging him out of arrogance or defiance. She was asserting her authority, and he had been too blinded by his assumptions to see it. Dr. Hayes clenched his jaw, a mix of anger and embarrassment coursing through him. He wasn't used to being wrong, and he certainly wasn't used to being put in his place. But as much as he hated to admit it, a small part of him couldn't help but respect her. She had handled him without raising her voice, without resorting to the kind of aggression he often employed. It was a power move, and it had worked. But if she thought this was the end of the story, she was mistaken. Dr. Hayes wasn't going to roll over and accept this new dynamic without a fight. He had built his career on being the best, and he wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how impressive their credentials, change that. Meanwhile, Dr. Bennett was in her office, reviewing the hospital's latest performance metrics. She had a long road ahead of her, and she knew that earning the respect of the staff wouldn't happen overnight. But she wasn't here to be liked. She was here to make a difference, and if that meant stepping on a few toes along the way, so be it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that her earlier encounter with Dr. Hayes was just the beginning of a larger battle. For now, she let herself focus on the work. The hospital needed her, and she wasn't about to let anyone distract her from her mission, not even the formidable Dr. Hayes. But deep down, she knew that their paths would cross again, and when they did, it would be a clash neither of them would forget. The stage was set, and the tension between them was only beginning to build. The next day began like any other in the hospital, but the air seemed charged with an unspoken tension. Staff moved quickly through the halls, their eyes darting between tasks, but there was an underlying buzz of anticipation. The news of Dr. Bennett's position as chief of medicine had spread like wildfire, and with it came a mix of curiosity, respect, and for some, uncertainty. Dr. Hayes, however, remained resolute. He refused to let this sudden shake-up rattle him. After all, he had been running this hospital in his own way for years, and no newcomer, no matter how impressive her title, was going to change that. In the all that morning, the tension was palpable. Dr. Hayes moved through the pre-op briefing with his usual precision, but his voice carried an extra edge. The surgical team exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Everyone knew better than to challenge him when he was like this. He was laser-focused, his movements methodical, but beneath the surface, his thoughts were anything but calm. Every time he gave an order, he found himself wondering if Dr. Bennett was somewhere nearby, watching, judging. The thought irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Dr. Bennett was making her presence felt in a quieter but equally impactful way. She spent her morning meeting with department heads, listening to their concerns, and offering solutions that were both practical and insightful. Her approach was calculated but genuine. She knew that to make meaningful changes, she needed to build relationships first. Still, there was one department head she hadn't spoken to yet, and she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. Later that afternoon, Dr. Bennett decided it was time to confront the inevitable. She made her way to Dr. Hayes' office, her heels kicking softly against the polished floor. She knocked once and then opened the door, stepping inside with the same calm confidence she always carried. Dr. Hayes looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. "Dr. Hayes," Dr. Bennett began, her tone professional but firm. "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Is that so?" he replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Well, by all means, let's talk." She took a seat across from him, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm not here to step on toes or undermine the work you've done here," she said. but as chief of medicine, it's my responsibility to ensure this hospital operates at its best. That means collaboration, mutual respect, and a willingness to adapt when necessary. Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Mutual respect, he repeated. That's rich, coming from someone who decided to make her grand entrance by calling me out in front of the staff. Dr. Bennett didn't flinch. Respect isn't about avoiding confrontation, Dr. Hayes, she said. It's about addressing issues head-on and finding solutions. That's what I intend to do here. Her words hung in the air, challenging him in a way that few had dared before. For a moment, he considered pushing back, letting his frustration boil over. But something about her steady gaze stopped him. She wasn't trying to provoke him. She was trying to level with him, to reach some kind of understanding. It was disarming, and for the first time in years, he felt the slightest twinge of doubt about his approach. But just as quickly as the doubt appeared, he pushed it aside. Fine, he said finally, his tone clipped. If collaboration is what you want, then let's collaborate, but don't expect me to change overnight. Dr. Bennett gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. I wouldn't expect anything less, she said. Change takes time, but it starts with a willingness to try. As she left his office, Dr. Hayes found himself staring at the door long after it had closed. Her words lingered in his mind, unsettling and strangely compelling. He didn't like being challenged, but there was something about her approach, her calm, unyielding determination, that he couldn't ignore. It made him uneasy, but it also made him curious. The days that followed were a delicate dance between the two of them. Dr. Bennett continued to assert her authority in subtle but effective ways, while Dr. Hayes did his best to maintain control of his department. Their interactions were polite on the surface, but beneath the veneer of professionalism, the tension simmered. Staff began to notice the dynamic between them, and it quickly became a topic of conversation in break rooms and hallways. She's not afraid of him, that's for sure, one nurse whispered to her colleague. I've never seen anyone stand up to Dr. Hayes like that. Maybe it's what he needs, the other replied. Someone who won't back down. Maybe it'll finally make him see he's not the only one who matters here. But not everyone was on Dr. Bennett's side. Some of the more senior staff viewed her as an outsider, someone who didn't understand the hospital's unique culture. They saw her attempts to implement changes as disruptive rather than constructive, and they weren't shy about voicing their concerns, but always in hushed tones, far from her earshot. For her part, Dr. Bennett took it all in stride. She knew that change was never easy and that resistance was part of the process. What mattered was staying true to her vision and proving, through her actions, that she was here to make things better for everyone. But as much as she tried to focus on the bigger picture, she couldn't shake the feeling that her battle with Dr. Hayes was far from over. One evening, as she reviewed patient outcomes in her office, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see one of the nurses, a younger woman named Ella, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Dr. Bennett, do you have a moment? Ella asked, her voice tentative. Of course, Dr. Bennett replied, gesturing for her to come in. What's on your mind? Ella hesitated for a moment before speaking. It's about Dr. Hayes, she said finally. I know he's a brilliant surgeon, but sometimes he can be really hard on the staff. I've seen people leave the OR in tears because of the way he talks to them. Dr. Bennett's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly. Thank you for sharing that with me, Ella, she said. I know it's not easy to speak up about these things. I'm working on building a culture where everyone feels respected and valued, no matter their role, but it's going to take time. Ella nodded, looking somewhat relieved. I just thought you should know, she said. A lot of us are rooting for you. We need someone like you here. As Ella left the office, Dr. Bennett sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had known that Dr. Hayes' reputation was less than perfect, but hearing it directly from the staff made it all the more real. She couldn't ignore it, but addressing it head-on would require tact and strategy. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the tension between them, but she also couldn't let the status quo continue. Conversation that had just taken place. He still viewed Dr. Bennett as an obstacle, someone who didn't understand the pressure he was under or the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had a point. Maybe the hospital could be better. Maybe he could be better. Neither of them knew it yet, but the decisions they made in the coming days would not only define their relationship, but also shape the future of the hospital itself. The tension between them was only growing, and the true conflict was just beginning to unfold. The hospital had become a battleground of unspoken tensions, with every interaction between Dr. Bennett and Dr. Hayes feeling like a strategic move in a high-stakes chess game. To the casual observer, they were two professionals doing their jobs. But to anyone who paid closer attention, the cracks in their dynamic were becoming increasingly obvious. Their exchanges were always measured, their words carefully chosen, but the tension beneath them was impossible to ignore. Dr. Hayes threw himself deeper into his work, determined to prove that he didn't need oversight from anyone, least of all Dr. Bennett. He stayed in the OR for hours, taking on back-to-back surgeries without so much as a break. The intensity of his schedule seemed almost self-imposed, as if he was trying to shield himself from the growing influence of his new boss. But the strain was beginning to show. He snapped at nurses over minor mistakes, barked orders without a hint of patience, and left a trail of stressed staff in his wake. Meanwhile, Dr. Bennett had her own battles to fight. While some staff had started warming up to her approach, others remained skeptical. There were whispers in the halls, questions about whether her changes were necessary or whether she understood the unique pressures of their hospital. She heard the murmurs, but didn't let them distract her. She had a plan, and she was determined to see it through, even if it meant stepping into uncomfortable territory. The tipping point came during a high-profile surgery. The patient was a young child with a rare and complex heart condition, and the case had drawn attention from across the region. Dr. Hayes, naturally, was leading the surgery, and he had assembled his most trusted team for the procedure. Dr. Bennett, aware of the significance of the case, decided to observe from the gallery. It was a delicate move, one that could easily be misinterpreted as micromanaging, but she felt it was important to show her support. As the surgery progressed, it became clear that something was off. Dr. Hayes, usually so precise and commanding in the OR, seemed distracted. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before making a critical incision, and his tone was sharper than usual as he gave instructions to his team. The nurses exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing with each passing minute. From the gallery, Dr. Bennett watched closely, her heart pounding. She could see the strain on Dr. Hayes' face, the way his jaw tightened with every step of the procedure. She wanted to intervene, to offer support or guidance, but she knew it wasn't her place. Not yet. All she could do was watch and hope that his skill and experience would carry him through. Then it happened. A small but critical error, a misstep in the placement of a clamp, caused a sudden complication. The monitors blared with alarms, and the room descended into chaos. Dr. Hayes barked orders, his voice rising as he tried to regain control of the situation. The tension in the OR was suffocating, every second dragging out like an eternity. Dr. Bennett couldn't stay silent any longer. She left the gallery and entered the OR, her presence immediately commanding attention. "Dr. Hayes," she said firmly but calmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "What do you need?" For a moment, he didn't respond. His pride and frustration battled against the reality of the situation. But as the alarms continued to wail, he realized he had no choice. "We need to stabilize the patient," he said through gritted teeth. "Now." Dr. Bennett stepped in, her demeanor calm and focused. She didn't take over. She knew that would only make things worse. But she guided the team with precision, offering suggestions and support where it was needed. Together, they managed to stabilize the patient, and the room finally began to settle. As the surgical team worked to finish the procedure, Dr. Hayes felt a wave of emotions wash over him: relief, exhaustion, and a sting of humiliation. He had made a mistake, and Dr. Bennett had seen it. More than that, she had stepped in to help. And while part of him was grateful, another part couldn't shake the feeling of being undermined. After the surgery, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Dr. Hale stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. Moments later, there was a knock. He didn't need to ask who it was. "Come in," he said, his voice tight. Dr. Bennett stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She closed the door quietly and stood there for a moment, studying him. "I'm not here to criticize you," she said finally. "I know how much pressure you are under in there." Dr. Hayes let out a bitter laugh. "Pressure? Don't patronize me, Dr. Bennett. I've been handling pressure long before you set foot in this hospital." She didn't flinch. "I'm not patronizing you," she said, "but I won't ignore what happened in that OR today. That wasn't about pressure. It was about something deeper. And whether you want to admit it or not, it's affecting your work." Her words struck a nerve, and he stood up, his frustration boiling over. "You think you know me?" he demanded. "You think you can just walk in here and fix everything? This hospital doesn't need saving, and I don't need saving." Dr. Bennett held her ground, her voice steady. "This isn't about saving anyone," she said. "It's about accountability. For yourself, for your team, and for the patients we serve. I'm not here to tear you down, Dr. Hayes. I'm here to build something better for all of us." Her words hung in the air, challenging him to face a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The room was heavy with unresolved tension, the conflict between them reaching its peak. Both of them knew that the next steps they took would determine not just their working relationship, but the future of the hospital itself. The stakes had never been higher, and neither of them was willing to back down. Dr. Hayes sat in his office after Dr. Bennett left, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than he wanted to admit. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, replaying the events in the OR. He hated the way she had taken control, hated the way she had been right. But what unsettled him more was the crack in his own confidence. For years, he had been the unshakable leader of this hospital, the one everyone turned to in moments of crisis. Yet, today, for the first time, he felt vulnerable, and he wasn't sure how to process it. As he stared blankly at his computer screen, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from one of the nurses. "Dr. Hayes, we need you in Ward C immediately. It's about Mr. Daniels." His stomach tightened. Mr. Daniels was one of his long-term patients, a man he'd grown close to over the years. Hayes didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the ward, his earlier frustration momentarily pushed aside. When he arrived, the room was chaotic. Nurses and a junior doctor were clustered around Mr. Daniels' bed, trying to stabilize him. The older man was struggling to breathe, his chest heaving with effort. Dr. Hayes stepped in, his tone calm but commanding. "What's going on?" he asked, scanning the monitors and the patient's chart. One of the nurses replied, "He started deteriorating about an hour ago. We've been trying to stabilize him, but nothing's working. His oxygen levels are plummeting." Hayes took over, directing the team with the precision he was known for. Within minutes, they managed to stabilize Mr. Daniels, though it was clear his condition was critical. Hayes stayed by his bedside, gripping the man's frail hand. "Hang in there, Mr. Daniels," he said softly. "We're not giving up on you." As he stood there, a strange feeling crept over him, a nagging sense that something wasn't adding up. Mr. Daniels had been stable just a day ago. His condition wasn't supposed to deteriorate this quickly. Hayes pulled one of the nurses aside. "Get me the records from his last round of medication," he said. "Something feels off." The nurse nodded and left to retrieve the files. Hayes paced the room, his mind racing. He prided himself on being meticulous, on catching details others might miss. And now his instincts were telling him that this wasn't just a natural progression of Mr. Daniels' illness. When the nurse returned with the records, Hayes flipped through them, his eyes scanning every detail. And then he saw it, a dosage error in the medication administered the night before. His heart sank. It was a small mistake, easily overlooked, but it was enough to have triggered this sudden decline. He clenched the file tightly in his hands, his mind flashing back to the chaos in the OR earlier. Was the hospital unraveling under the pressure, or had his own distractions played a role in letting these mistakes slip through? Before he could dwell on it, his pager buzzed. It was from Dr. Bennett. She wanted to see him in her office immediately. Hayes groaned internally. The last thing he needed was another confrontation, but he knew he couldn't ignore her. He handed the file to the nurse, instructing her to run further tests on Mr. Daniels, and made his way to Bennett's office. When he walked in, he was met with an unexpected sight. Dr. Bennett wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man Hayes recognized instantly, Paul Archer, a member of the hospital's board of directors. Archer was rarely seen at the hospital unless something serious was happening. Hayes' eyes narrowed as he took a seat. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone guarded. Bennett hesitated. "It's anonymous," she said carefully. "But the details match some of the incidents we've seen recently, including what happened in the OR today and the situation with Mr. Daniels." Hayes felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "You think I'm responsible for this?" he demanded. "I've given everything to this hospital. If there are issues, it's because we're understaffed and overworked, not because I'm not doing my job." Archer spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "Dr. Hayes, no one is accusing you of negligence, but we can't ignore the pattern. The board has decided to bring in an external auditor to assess the hospital's procedures." Hayes' hands clenched into fists. This was a blow he hadn't seen coming. An external auditor meant scrutiny, not just of his work, but of every decision he'd made as head surgeon. And while he knew he wasn't perfect, the thought of his leadership being questioned in this way felt like a personal attack. After the meeting, Hayes left Bennett's office feeling more isolated than ever. The hospital, his sanctuary, now felt like a minefield. Every step he took seemed to bring another challenge, another test of his resilience. And as he walked back to his office, his mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. The tension with Bennett, the mistakes in the OR, the deterioration of Mr. Daniels, it all felt connected somehow, but he couldn't see the full picture yet. Unbeknownst to Hayes, Dr. Bennett was also grappling with her own doubts. The anonymous complaint had caught her off guard, and while she knew it wasn't her place to reveal it, she had a strong suspicion about who had filed it. The question was, why now? And what were they hoping to achieve? The hospital was a pressure cooker, and the stakes were higher than ever. Both Hayes and Bennett knew they were on the brink of something major, something that would either tear them apart or force them to confront the truths they'd been avoiding. As the hours ticked by, the air grew heavier with anticipation, the conflicts reaching a boiling point that neither of them could ignore. Dr. Hayes barely slept that night, his mind running through every possible angle. The external audit, the complaint, Mr. Daniels' condition, everything felt like it was slipping out of his control. By the time the sun rose, he had resolved to get to the bottom of it all. He arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, walking through the hallways with a determination that masked the exhaustion in his eyes. The hospital was quiet at this hour, a temporary calm before the chaos of the day began. As he approached his office, he noticed something unusual, a file sitting on his desk, one he didn't remember leaving there. He opened it cautiously, and his heart skipped a beat. Inside were detailed notes about the recent mishaps in the hospital, including the dosage error with Mr. Daniels and the incident in the OR. But what caught his attention most was a note tucked at the back, written in an unfamiliar hand. "You're not the only one under scrutiny. Trust no one." Hayes stared at the note, his mind racing. Was this a warning? A threat? And who had left it? He was no closer to answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him. There was a deeper issue at play, one that someone didn't want him, or Dr. Bennett, to uncover. He decided to confront her. When he entered Bennett's office, she looked up from her desk, clearly surprised to see him. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her tone cautious. "What brings you here so early?" He held up the note. "I found this on my desk this morning," he said. "I think we need to talk." Bennett read the note, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. "I didn't leave this," she said firmly. "But it confirms something I've been suspecting. There's more going on here than we realize." Hay sat down, his defenses lowering slightly. For the first time, he and Bennett were on the same page. She pulled out her own files, showing him a series of discrepancies she had been investigating. Missing supplies, unexplained shifts in patient data, and unusual activity in the hospital's financial records. It painted a troubling picture, one that suggested someone within the hospital was manipulating the system for their own gain. "We're being set up," Bennett said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Someone wants us to fail. They're using these mistakes to pit us against each other while they operate in the shadows." Hay felt a chill run down his spine. It all made sense now. The anonymous complaint, the sudden audit, the pattern of errors that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Whoever was behind this was not just endangering patients, but also threatening the integrity of the hospital itself. As they dug deeper, a name kept coming up: Dr. Collins, a senior administrator who had always kept a low profile. Hayes remembered him as competent but unremarkable, someone who blended into the background. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Financial records linked Collins to a private contractor the hospital had recently hired, and several of the discrepancies traced back to his department. Hayes and Bennett decided to confront Collins together. They found him in his office, seemingly unbothered by the chaos unfolding around him. When they presented their findings, his reaction was unsettling. Instead of denying the allegations, he smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a shiver down Hayes' spine. "You're both very perceptive," Collins said, leaning back in his chair. "But you're too late. The audit isn't about fixing the hospital. It's about control. The board wants to privatize his place, and I'm just making sure it happens smoothly." Bennett's jaw tightened. "At the cost of patient safety, of people's lives." Collins shrugged. "Collateral damage. The board believes the hospital will be more efficient under private management. And frankly, you two have made it easy for me. Your little power struggle was the perfect distraction." Hayes felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You won't get away with this," he said. "We'll take this to the board, to the authorities if we have to." Collins stood, his demeanor unshaken. "Do what you want," he said. "But by the time you untangle this mess, it'll be too late. The contracts are already being signed." As Collins walked out, Hayes and Bennett were left reeling. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, but they knew they couldn't waste time. They spent the rest of the day gathering evidence, preparing to make their case to the board. It was a race against the clock, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. When the board meeting finally arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Hayes and Bennett presented their findings, laying out the evidence with precision and clarity. The board members listened intently, their expressions a mix of shock and skepticism. Collins, seated at the far end of the table, watched with an air of indifference. As the meeting drew to a close, Hayes delivered a final plea. "This hospital isn't just a business," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "It's a place where people come to heal, where lives are saved. If you let this go through, you're not just betraying us. You're betraying every patient who walks through those doors." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one of the board members spoke up. "We need to review this further. The decision isn't final yet." It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. Hayes and Bennett left the meeting knowing their fight wasn't over, but they had taken the first step. As they walked out of the building, Hayes turned to Bennett. "We make a good team," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through his usual seriousness. Bennett nodded. "Let's just hope it's enough." But as they parted ways, neither of them noticed Collins watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. The battle was far from over, and the final twist was yet to come. The days following the board meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Dr. Hayes and Dr. Bennett. The temporary pause on the decision to privatize the hospital gave them a slim window of opportunity to solidify their case and protect what they both had worked so hard to build. However, they knew that their fight against Dr. Collins and the forces backing him would not be easy. They spent long nights combing through hospital records, speaking to staff members, and piecing together a comprehensive timeline of the events that had led to this moment. They were fueled by a shared determination to expose the truth. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the hospital remained tense. Whispers of the board's deliberations spread among the staff, and many employees worried about what privatization might mean for their jobs and their patients. For some, it was a call to action. Nurses, technicians, and junior doctors who had felt powerless in the past began stepping forward with stories and evidence of their own. A united front started to form, with Hayes and Bennett at the helm, as the staff rallied around their shared mission to save the hospital from corporate greed. One day, a nurse approached Dr. Bennett with a document she had found during a routine shift. It was an internal memo sent by Dr. Collins to a private contractor weeks before the audit had begun. The memo outlined plans to streamline hospital operations in preparation for new management, including cutting staff in critical departments and outsourcing essential services. The memo was the smoking gun they had been looking for, proof that the push for privatization had been orchestrated from within, with little regard for the hospital's well-being. Armed with this new evidence, Hayes and Bennett called for an emergency meeting with the board. This time, they arrived not just with their own findings, but with the support of the hospital staff. Doctors, nurses, and administrative workers filled the room, their presence a silent but powerful reminder of what was at stake. Bennett began the presentation, her voice steady as she laid out the full extent of Collins' involvement. Hayes followed, tying the memo to the broader pattern of sabotage and negligence that had plagued the hospital. The tension in the room was thick as Collins was asked to respond. For the first time, he seemed rattled. He tried to deflect, accusing Hayes and Bennett of orchestrating a smear campaign, but the evidence was undeniable. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly torn between their prior plans and the weight of the accusations. Finally, one of them spoke. "We cannot ignore what has been presented here. Dr. Collins, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." A wave of relief swept through the room, but Hayes and Bennett knew their work wasn't over. The decision to halt privatization was still tentative, and the hospital's future remained uncertain. They turned their focus to rebuilding trust within the institution. Together, they organized meetings with staff to address their concerns and outline steps to improve operations. Hayes, who had always been seen as aloof, made a conscious effort to connect with his colleagues on a personal level, earning their respect in a way he hadn't before. Bennett, meanwhile, continued her hands-on approach, proving that her leadership was as compassionate as it was effective. In the weeks that followed, the hospital began to stabilize. The investigation into Collins uncovered a network of shady dealings that extended far beyond the hospital, leading to multiple arrests and the termination of several questionable contracts. The board, shaken by the revelations, decided to scrap the privatization plans entirely and implement stricter oversight measures to ensure accountability going forward. Hayes and Bennett were praised for their leadership, and their once contentious relationship had transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect. One afternoon, as the dust finally began to settle, Hayes found himself standing outside the hospital, gazing up at the building that had been his second home for so many years. Bennett joined him, her expression reflective. "We did it," she said, breaking the silence. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We did, but it wasn't just us, it was everyone, every nurse, every doctor, every staff member who stood up and said, 'This is worth fighting for.'" Bennett looked at him, a glimmer of warmth in her eyes. "You've changed, you know. You're not the same person who stormed into that all months ago." Hayes chuckled softly. "Neither are you. Maybe we both needed this, needed each other, to see the bigger picture." As they stood there, the sounds of the bustling hospital behind them, a sense of hope filled the air. The challenges they had faced had tested them in ways they never could have anticipated, but they had come out stronger, not just as individuals but as leaders. The hospital, too, had been transformed, not by the corporate takeover Collins had envisioned, but by the resilience and unity of the people who made it what it was. In the end, it wasn't just about saving a hospital. It was about preserving the heart of what healthcare was meant to be, a place of healing, compassion, and community. And as Hayes and Bennett walked back inside, ready to face whatever came next, they knew they had done something extraordinary. Together, they had proven that even in the face of betrayal and adversity, integrity and determination could prevail.